Good morning, everyone. How are you? People are just arriving in, so we'll just give a little minute for people to log on. Thank you so much for joining us as we close off Global Kinship Care Week with the last webinar of our series. We've had a jam-packed week. We started off Monday with a webinar on an introduction to kinship care for professionals. So if anyone missed that, you're very welcome to access a recording. Today's webinar will be recorded just to preface that, which you can access again. So just to remind if anyone has any questions, to pop them into the Q&A box and we will answer them just to try and keep them anonymous. We also had webinars for self-care for kinship carers on Tuesday. We had an event on Wednesday in Wood Quay, which was full of powerful conversations from kinship carers, very much taking the centre stage as they should. And really, really a wonderful event. Yesterday, we were at the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Drugs, starting a conversation or continuing a conversation from the Citizens' Assembly from 2023. And yeah, so it's been a jam-packed week of campaigning and awareness raising, and we're really delighted to be joined by Sinead Roe here this morning. As many of you might know, Quality Matters are supporting the Department of Children's ongoing policy work to address the rights of children in informal kinship care, and Quality Matters have been doing the consultation process with kinship carers and birth parent supports for their survey alike. So we're delighted to be joined by Sinead Rowe from Quality Matters to discuss ways to nurture safe and healthy relationships and practical strategies for supporting children who may have experienced upheaval, trauma, or adversity. And we know that children in kinship care have often experienced those adversities. So it's really important to have some tools in the toolkit to ensure we have that knowledge in the back burner to support children in our care or to support kinship carers and children who we may be working with. So we're really delighted to welcome Sinead Rowe this morning, an experienced social work with a particular interest in trauma-informed approaches and with past experience of working in New Zealand with kinship carers, which was a really a great area for us to latch on to experience and learning from Sinead. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Sinead, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Laura. Lovely to be here with you. I'm just going to share my slides. Here we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. Hi, everyone. My name is Sinead. As Laura said, I work with Quality Matters, and my job in Quality Matters is to lead our trauma-informed practice program. So what we do is we provide training and support to organisations all over Ireland who are working with people who have experienced trauma and who want to learn more about a trauma-informed approach. So trauma-informed basically means that if you may have heard the word before, it's a word that's used a lot, but not explained in the same way always. So from our point of view, being trauma informed, what that means is that you take into account the fact that the people that you are working with, so we train mostly professionals and workers, but when people have experienced trauma, basically that continues to have an impact even after the traumatic experience has finished. And for somebody who is offering a service or support to a person who's experienced trauma, they need to understand how that experience can continue to affect somebody and what that means then for service provision. So I will get into that shortly, but I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. So as Laura said, I am a social worker. My work experience started out, I worked for probably about close to 15 years in the disability sector as a social care worker. And I was working with children and families in the community there, and young people as well. So basically, kind of as a community support worker, I suppose, working at home with kids. I also worked in a residential school for children with autism, and I moved to New Zealand during that time, and I started working for an organization. It was an NGO that provided support services, so mostly respite services to autistic children and young people. But the bulk of their work was in doing child protection, social work, and foster care. So possibly similar to Bernardo's, to kind of the kind of work that Bernardo's would do in Ireland. It was a national organization and very long-standing foster care provider. So big foster care provider. Also worked with families where kinship care was involved as well. And in New Zealand, I was saying to Laura, one of the differences I think between the system in New Zealand and Ireland is that when children are in kinship care, they still have a social worker, and they have all of the support that the kinship carers have all of the support that foster carers would have, and they have access to all of the same information, but also and training and opportunities and things like that. But also critically, the child has a social worker, which means that the kinship carers have additional support through an organization who is dedicated to kind of helping caregivers, I suppose, navigate the complexities of caring for children who have experienced trauma. So that was my job in New Zealand. So the organization that I worked for, as I said, very experienced in providing foster care, very experienced in working with families and extended families. And what they found was that the work that they were doing was not really working. So we had in most instances people who were minding children, people who had children living with them, who were supporting children, who had successfully raised their own families, who had positive experiences of parenting, or who had parented themselves kind of against the odds. But what they were finding was that when when children were coming to live with them, whether as foster parents or as kinship carers, they were finding it really difficult to meet the needs of those children, and they wanted to know why. And we wanted to know why as well. So we were doing the best that we could to support them, and in spite of our best efforts, things were really difficult. So what we started to learn as an organization, we started to learn about the impact of trauma on children and young people, and how experiences of neglect or abuse or disrupted attachment, how those experiences had a huge impact on children even long after the traumatic experience was finished. So I did a couple of years of study as part of my role with a psychiatrist who's based in the States called Bruce Perry. And I learned a lot about how experience of trauma can impact children, and it helped me to understand so much about the kids that I was working with, about their parents' experiences, and about how to help people who were looking after those children and providing care for those children, how they could meet the needs of children better. So, learning about trauma and trauma-informed practice and trauma-informed care really completely transformed my world, I suppose, as a social worker. It was transformative for our organizations. And what we found was that we were able to give much more effective and relevant support that was actually genuinely meeting the needs of children, rather than what had been happening previously, where I think that we might have had, as professionals, we might have had unrealistic expectations of children and really not understood at all what was happening for them and where they were coming from. So I'm very, very passionate about this subject, and I am going to talk you through some of the stuff that I learned and have learned in the past this morning, and hopefully that will be useful to you. Okay, so our agenda for this morning, I am going to be talking, first of all, just about understanding of trauma and sort of the basics of how experiences of trauma impact infants, children, and young people. Then I am going to be talking about trauma with kids. So when children are in your care, and how to talk about their experiences, how to do that in a way that is respectful and that is useful to them and that does no harm. We're going to be talking about some of the more difficult then aspects of caring for children who are in kinship care for the rest of the session. So that includes things like navigating access and also how to manage special occasions. So things like Christmas and birthdays and communions and kind of big events in children's lives, how to make sure that those I suppose the wheels don't come off and that those are the least stressful and the most enjoyable for everybody. It's not possible most of the time to have no stress or angst or pain or distress associated with some of those big events. But what we can do is we can do the best that we can. So we're going to be talking about some practical tips for that as well. So into our first section then is understanding trauma. So we're going to be talking this morning about what is trauma at different types, and then what does it mean for anybody who experiences trauma, but in particular, what does it mean for children? So this is a definition that is used by SAMHSA. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration in the United States. So you can see why they call it SAMHSA for short. They published a document in 2014. They published a document called Concept of Trauma and Guidance for a Trauma-Informed Approach. And it's available on the internet, and it's really a kind of a blueprint, I suppose, for understanding what trauma is, and then understanding what does that mean then for being trauma informed. So their definition of trauma, on the screen, I have put in bold 3 E's. So their definition is that individual trauma results from an event or series of events or circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So let me just unpack that a little bit. So an event or series of events. So something happens or something happens continuously. So either a one-off incident like a car accident or something like that, or a series of events or circumstances. So for many children who have experienced trauma, what trauma looks like is actually living in a situation, living in an environment with caregivers and primary caregivers who are either something is happening in that environment where the child's needs are not being met. So they are not experiencing what they should be experiencing in terms of good quality care. So having a primary caregiver who is present, who is attuned, so who is able to meet the child's needs, who is responsive, and who is able to give them the love and care that they need for the different developmental stages that they are at. So it can mean an absence of those things. And then very often, although not always, that can be accompanied by the presence of circumstances or events that children should not experience. And those are things like physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. So that's an example. Those things can be complicated then by having violence present between the adults in the house, or maybe having an adult in the household who has a mental illness. So things like that can be complicating factors as well. Okay, so that's our first E is the event. Our second E then is the experience, and this is really important. So the event or the circumstances are experienced by the individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. So the child's experience of those events is the next kind of key factor in whether or not is it trauma. We can't say. So trauma impacts everybody differently. You and I could be sitting in a car together, and we could be in a car accident, and I could experience that as emotionally harmful, and you could not. So there are lots of things that impact our whether we experience things as traumatic, but really that is kind of it's a nod towards the fact that trauma is subjective, and that everybody experiences traumatic experiences in different ways. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Okay, so the last E then in our three E's is the effects. So the idea with when we are wanting to know what is trauma and what is not trauma, what we have to ask, the next question to ask is, does it have a lasting adverse effect on the person's functioning or their well-being in various different areas? So that's mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual. So when we talk about trauma, what we are talking about is things that have a lasting impact long after the traumatic experience might be finished. And this is what we see, I think, and this is what had certainly professionals, but also carers, I think, kind of confused for many, many years, because we used to think that if we took a child out of a situation where they were experiencing harm, and we put them into a situation where they were experiencing good quality care, where they weren't being harmed anymore, where they were safe both emotionally and physically, then everything should be fine. And what we find is that actually that is definitely not the case. That children continue to have an impact on their functioning and on their mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So just a little bit on different types of trauma, and I want to especially call attention to the second and third points in this list. So we have single incident trauma, which is kind of just a one-off event. So that could be something like maybe experiencing, like I said, a car accident or maybe a house fire. But for many children, what they have experienced is what we call complex trauma, where trauma is experienced, or a traumatic experience happens over and over and over again, or they're living in a set of circumstances where, so for example, if they experience neglect, that would count as complex trauma. And usually as well, complex trauma is experienced in the context of the relationship with the primary caregiver. So not always, but often the primary caregiver of the child is I suppose the source of a traumatic experience. So for example, if there's physical abuse by a primary caregiver, what you see is that is kind of like a double insult, if you like, to the child's experience, because not only are they experiencing trauma over and over again, but they're also experiencing it from the person who they are relying on to keep themselves safe, from the person who they have their primary attachment with. And I'm sure that you have learned or heard of attachment and the importance of attachment before now, but you can you just very briefly, children form attachment relationships, which are special bonds to their primary caregiver, often their mother, but it doesn't have to be their mother. And this attachment relationship is the basis for the child's kind of development and understanding of the world. So when the attachment relationship has trauma kind of woven into it, it is very, very confusing for children because their sense of safety can really be disrupted. And the next point on the list, then, in terms of types of trauma, is what we call developmental trauma. And developmental trauma is essentially trauma that's experienced during either prenatally, during infancy, childhood, and adolescence, and this is when our brains are developing. So from conception onwards, there's a huge kind of trajectory in terms of physical and brain development. And I'm going to try and just draw for you on the screen a very scientific chart that kind of shows this. So if we have conception here, we start off with conception, and our physical development kind of goes on a trajectory like this throughout kind of childhood and adolescence, and keeps going up until we kind of reach kind of physical maturity, usually sometime in the mid to late teens. Brain development is more like this. So in the first 3 years, we have a huge amount of brain development happening, and then we have a kind of a drop off. And so our brain development is, and this is one of the reasons why they say the first 3 years are very, very important, because we have so much development, so much activity happening in infancy and early childhood. And when we talk about developmental trauma, what we are talking about is the fact that we have so many brain functions that are organizing and developing really, really rapidly during this time, so that when we experience trauma at this time, it can actually affect the way that our brains and bodies develop and function. That is developmental trauma. Then we have historical or intergenerational trauma, and some of you will be very familiar with this as well. So this is the idea that essentially that in some families, trauma is passed on from generation to generation. And what that means is that basically you have parents whose capacity to kind of to deal with challenges might be affected by their own experience of having been raised and parented, and then they are raising children, and they may be raising children who have their own challenges, physical or psychological, and their capacity to meet the needs of their children is impacted. And then when those children grow up and become parents themselves, their capacity to meet the needs of their own kids is impacted as well. And so what we have is kind of patterns of, I suppose, challenge and adversity that are seen from generation to generation. Now, we also have people always in those families who are able to, with support and through personal circumstances, are able to kind of break free of those patterns, and to establish healthy, functional, successful lives. So it's by no means a guarantee that this can happen, but it's definitely an issue to be aware of. Then we have just two more types that I want to just discuss very briefly. So discrimination is considered to be a type of trauma in itself. So if you are a member of a minority group, and you are experiencing, for example, racism, religious discrimination, homophobia, ableism, so discrimination on the basis of disability, all of those things are considered to be traumatic as well. And they are things that are often present in children's lives, as well as having experienced maybe complex or developmental trauma. And then the last thing that I just want to mention very briefly as well this morning is vicarious trauma. So vicarious trauma is a particular type of psychological distress that can be experienced by people who are aware of the traumatic experiences of others. So, vicarious trauma is sometimes referred to as the cost of caring, and it is something that caregivers, I think, really need to be aware of, because nothing needs to happen to you personally as an individual. So all of the other types of trauma, those are all things that they're experienced just by the individual. But vicarious trauma is being exposed to the trauma stories and the trauma experiences of others, and how that can be distressing for us as adults, as people who may have no experience ourselves, direct experience of trauma ourselves. But it's really it's a type of distress that we can experience, where we start to have maybe intrusive thoughts about the traumatic experience of others, where we are deeply affected emotionally by this, where we might be losing sleep, we might be wanting to avoid any kind of trigger or memory or association associated with the trauma. And it is, unfortunately, it's something that can happen. If it has happened to you in the past, what I would recommend is that you would reach out to any kind of organization that you are getting support from, to ask about resources that might be available, like counseling or further information. Okay, so those are some types of trauma. Just going to turn off my pen. All right. So a little bit about how experience of trauma actually affects us. And when I say that I learned about this, and I was absolutely fascinated to learn about the brain and how much neuroscience actually kind of influences our understanding of what happens for kids and young people. So essentially, when we are born with only one part of our brain really fully developed, and that is this part here, the brainstem. This part of our brain affects our ability to manage functions like things like heart rate, blood pressure, temperature. It has a little bit to do with our motor skills, so our kind of the way that we control our limbs and our body, and then also our stress response, so our fight or flight response. And if you've ever spent time with a very small baby, you will kind of see that they can master some of those functions, and but they can't do other things. So we are born really with a lot of these functions intact, but then the rest of our brain is still developing. So what does that mean? So our limbic system is the next part of our brain to really kind of come online and start developing in infancy and kind of throughout early childhood. And this is the part of our brain that regulates things like our relationships and our emotions. So we form attachments, as I mentioned earlier, to a primary caregiver, and then we form relationships then with other people. So first relationship is with a primary caregiver. That's usually mum or dad. And then as a kind of time goes on, our relational world, we call it, expands to include other people. We have very little ability to manage our emotions in infancy and early childhood, but as time goes on, our capacity to manage our emotions gets kind of more mature, and our self-regulation skills come online, and we're able to depend on those a lot more. The last part of our brain to develop is called the cortex, and this part of the brain is really important for all of the skills that we develop as we mature into adulthood. So there's a set of skills called executive functioning skills that we develop during childhood and adolescence, and those are skills like communication, the ability to use our working memory to learn, emotional regulation. So that's also a feature of the cortex, is basically how our experience of the world helps us to kind of stay on track and stay what we call regulated. So to stay calm, to not be overwhelmed by our emotions, that's a skill that we are building up during childhood and adolescence. And some of our other kind of skills in terms of learning as well are in the cortex. So why learn about this? What does it mean? Why is it of interest when we are talking about trauma? Well, it is because our neural pathways, so the parts of our brain that we use the most, are the parts that become the strongest and the most efficient. So when we experience trauma, what we experience is a lack of safety. So it is, as I said, it is that experience of physical or emotional harm or a threat to our safety. And when we experience this, this is the part of the brain that lights up, right? This part of the brain that comes on board, the brain stem, okay? And if we have this part of the brain online, then this part of the brain, all of the, where we have our emotional management, where we have our learning, and we have our self-regulation, our communication skills, this is kind of offline. So it's not completely offline. You're still able to communicate when you are in fight or flight. But what happens is that this part of the brain is really concerned with survival, and survival is the number one priority of our brains. So when we experience trauma, and especially when we experience trauma as we're growing up, what can happen is that this is the part of the brain that is used the most often. And it becomes kind of our default. So what that means is that it can be very, very sensitive, and anything that we perceive as a challenge or a threat to our safety can mean that we immediately go here, and we start to use our brainstem. And what we see then for children who have experienced trauma, what we see is that they can go from basically from 0 to 100 in a matter of seconds. So I have heard it described a little bit like a dimmer switch, where you know, all of us kind of have you know, our ability to kind of, sometimes we are calm and sometimes we are not so calm, and we are you know, we get kind of escalated, or we kind of tend to switch off as well. So we can kind of go into a stress response that is a kind of a freeze response. But it's like we're on a continuum. So we're going up and down and up and down. And what happens with kids and young people who have experienced trauma is that it can be more like a light switch. So it's literally on, off. And you can see that if you just kind of, if you say the wrong thing or if you do the wrong thing, that you have, then the child has an absolutely massive reaction, something that you wouldn't expect, and something that if you don't know why they're reacting the way that they are, that you might misunderstand that and think that it is the child being bold, or the child being rude or aggressive or manipulative. And in actual fact, most of the time it's because children's stress response of this part of the brain has been triggered. Okay, so some of the impact of trauma then on the brain and on functioning. So how does it show up? Well, this will probably be no surprise to you if you are caring for a child who has experienced trauma, that development can be affected. So one of the things that I always used to say to caregivers is, try to look at stage, not age. So sometimes we have expectations of children that they are 6 years old or 10 years old or 14 years old, and that they're able to do certain things, that they have certain skills, and that they can manage certain situations. And what I always used to say is, look at the stage. So what stage of development or what age would you associate the kind of the skill level with, and then relate to the child at that stage, rather than having an expectation of them because they're 12 they're able to put their own clothes on, or because they're 14 they're able to catch the bus. They may not be at that stage, and they may have actually missed out on some of the development that they have to do. And that is because really development is like a series of steps, and we can't really skip those steps. So the foundations are laid basically kind of one block on top of another. What can happen then when we experience trauma, either by not having the stimulation and the opportunity to develop the skills that we should have, or else when we experience things like abuse and danger, what can happen is our brainstem becomes our default. So we spend time developing and strengthening the neural pathways in that part of the brain, and that means then that the neural pathways in the cortex, in the areas of the brain we need for like things like planning, understanding consequences, being able to understand cause and effect, empathy, self-regulation, all of those kinds of things then can have to take a bit of a back seat. So, so development can be affected. This also affects then relationships are one of the big things that can be affected. So I heard a person say, and I don't know if it was a quote from somebody else, so it may be, and I may not be attributing this to the right person, but she said something that struck me. She said, trauma involves relational wounding, and recovery must involve relational healing. So what she meant by that is especially for children, that most of the time what trauma involves is actually harm in the context of a relationship. So children are learning very, very busily in kind of throughout children and adolescence what kind of place the world is, and what kind of how do relationships feel and what do relationships look like. So if they have learned that relationships are something not to be trusted, that in a relationship you can be hurt, that in a relationship you might not be safe, then they will carry that forward as a self-protective kind of way of being and way of coping. And what that can mean then is that for other adults coming into that child's life and saying, I'm here to look after you. You can believe me. You can trust me. I'm going to keep you safe. I'm not going to hurt you. That the child may see that and say, well, that's all well and good, but all of my experience has been the opposite. So it will take much longer for that child to actually trust and feel safe with in relationships. What we then often see is a pattern where children will kind of get into a kind of a push-pull with a trusted caregiver in their life, where they will desperately want love and security and attachment. But then when they start to experience that, that can feel really uncomfortable, and then they push that person away, and they can do that by being aggressive, by being mean, by being rude, or by just kind of having a meltdown. And often caregivers are left wondering, what did I do? And, how do I get through to this child? And the only advice that I can give really is that when you understand what's happening for the child, it's much easier not to take it personally. But then also, you have to kind of understand that relationships are going to take a long, long, long time. That you can definitely get there, and I have seen it a lot. But you really, really need to be very, very patient. The third kind of major effect that I have observed in children in terms of experience trauma is in learning. So memory, communication, and self-regulation skills can all be challenged. And what that means is that often children have a really hard time in school. They have a hard time sitting still. They have a hard time controlling their impulses. They have a hard time remembering things and using their working memory, and with communicating their needs and communicating what they know to teachers. So that can be really, really challenging as well. The good news, however, is that that we do have uh, and some important kind of caveats, um, and those are that trauma impacts different people in different ways. So um, experience of trauma is not a kind of a one-way street to all of these difficulties. It is definitely good that to know that these things can occur, and many of you may have experienced these things already, but it's not a foregone conclusion. Essentially, we don't know how experiences are going to affect children. There are important protective factors that we need to take into account as well. And the number one important protective factor is the presence of a safe relationship. So whenever I hear about somebody who has had a really difficult time in childhood, and they are a healthy, functional, successful adult, I always am wondering, who was the safe adult in that child's life? Who was the person who provided that child with the experience of safety, with an experience of connection, and with an experience that that there is an adult to meet their needs. So I was listening to Katrina O'Sullivan. She is a very well-known author and academic, and she published her autobiography, and in it she describes her experience in childhood, which is an amazing story. But what interested me especially was that she had a teacher who really believed in her. She had a teacher who saw her, who looked after her, who helped her to feel as though she was worthy of care, and she was worthy of attention, and that she could achieve something in spite of the fact that her own parents were unfortunately not able to do that with her. I have another friend who I was talking to recently and getting to know, and this friend as well had a very, very chaotic childhood. Two parents with mental illness and issues with addiction on and off throughout his childhood. And this person is incredibly successful and has had kind of, by all the major markers, a lot of success in his life. And so he was talking, and I didn't ask the question, but then eventually he said, yeah, he said, home was not a safe place for me when I was a child, but I had a best friend, and I used to spend a lot of time in his house and with his family, and his house was a safe place for me. And it was there that he had an experience of safety. So having protective factors can absolutely counterbalance some of the impact of trauma. Um, Another really important thing that I want to talk about is something called neuroplasticity. So, neuroplasticity is the idea that, remember a couple of slides ago, I talked about the fact that the brain is developing at a huge rate throughout childhood. So what that can mean is that trauma can have a more significant impact in childhood than it does in adulthood. But it also means that we can recover quicker because essentially our brains are plastic, they are moldable. And the younger we are, the more moldable they are. So if you think of a brain being made of plasticine, you can shape it and mold it according to experience. And that's what our brains are designed to do. They're supposed to change according to our experiences. So if we have experienced harm, then we can also recover and heal when we experience safety and love and protection. And I want to show you what this can look like. So this is a little boy that I worked with in New Zealand. Um, so, okay, I'm going to draw your attention first to down here. So this is essentially a map of brain function, right? And all of these numbers here indicate where a typical 3-year-old's function would be in terms of kind of, being able to do certain things. So this is all of the stuff that our brain does. So all of our learning, all of our language, our kind of regulating body functions, all of that stuff. All right. And the key down here is that 12 is a fully developed brain, and then 1 is severe dysfunction. So this is a little fella that I was working with, and I did an assessment and a report on him at age 3 years and 10 months. And what you can see is, so this is a typical child of his age, and then this is my little fella here who has a lot of underdevelopment. And some delay in many of the areas that he should be kind of catching up on as a 3-year-old. So what we did for this little guy is we put in place a lot of structure, a lot of predictability, a lot of therapeutic activities, and not just therapeutic like you might be thinking about speech therapy or physiotherapy or whatever. What I mean by therapeutic activities is activities that he experienced where he got sensory input that made him feel safe and that helped him to feel calm. So that was things like swimming. He loved swimming. And so we make sure that he went swimming 3 times a week. We also made sure that his routine was really predictable, so he knew what was coming next during the daytime. We put into place a really solid bedtime routine to make sure that he kind of had the best opportunity to get good sleep every night. We had story time with him because he loved reading stories, but he was reading stories now together with his caregiver, and they would sit together in a kind of like a swinging chair every day at the same time, and they would read stories together. And what we found was that over time, this child really started to catch up in a lot of the areas that he was struggling in. And so I repeated his assessment nearly a year later. And what we can see here is that he has made huge gains and that he is nearly at a kind of an age typical level at many of his different areas of brain function. So I wanted to share that with you because I wanted to kind of evidence the fact that, you know, children can catch up, I suppose. They really can. And that the story of trauma is not a story of hopelessness. That for children, when they receive the right quality care and when they experience safety in the context of a relationship, especially with a primary caregiver, no matter who that person is, that they can really heal, and that their brains are incredibly responsive to any kind of positive experiences that we can offer them. Okay, let me just turn off my laser pointer. All right. So that is kind of the theory part of this morning. I just need to stop sharing my screen for 1 second so that I can check the time. Okay, so we have about 40 minutes left to talk about tips for things that children can find especially difficult, or that things that caregivers can feel kind of a little bit like they need support with. So the next thing that I want to talk about is talking about trauma. And it can be really hard to know how to have certain conversations with children. So how do we have these difficult conversations? What do we say when children ask us, why am I living with you? Why can't I live with my mom and dad? Or what happened? Or maybe they start telling us a story of something that we find upsetting, that happened to them before they came to live with us. So the kind of the major pointers are that I would advise you to do is to always take things at the child's pace. So I would never ask them to talk to me about, what they think about having to come, like to leave their parents' care, or to tell me any details about a traumatic experience of abuse or neglect that they might have had. So you let the child decide, essentially giving children control and letting the child decide when they are going to tell you what is really, really important. The other thing that's really important is to be honest with them. So that this is kind of really related to being honest, but also being age appropriate. So what that means is that, like, one of the principles of trauma-informed care is trustworthiness and transparency. So we tell the truth to children wherever we can and wherever it is appropriate for them to know, but we do so in a way that is age appropriate and without judgment of anyone. Now, this can sound really hard, like, how do we do this? But I want to give you an example, and this is a lovely example of a type of story that can be created for children called a words and pictures. Words and pictures is essentially an explanation for children as to why they have had to leave their parents' care. It's usually created by a social worker, and so you may not have access to, like, the ability to create one. But what I want to show you in this words and pictures that I have an example of is how they tell the story of what's happened to a child, but they tell it in a way that is both entirely honest and also that refrains from judgment. Okay, and that may seem really, really hard to do, but it is possible to do. So let's have a look. Okay, so this is a words and pictures, and this one was on the internet. It is from Hertfordshire Safeguarding Boards. So I just want to show you, I just want to draw attention to the story. So people were worried about Daniel because his mom, Julie, and dad, Mike, were together. There was drinking and fighting. Daniel was sad when the police took them away. Grandma Gwen came and took Daniel to her home. Daniel told social worker Carol and Grandma Gwen that Dad tickles him too hard and hits him too hard with pillows when Dad drinks, and it hurts Daniel. And these are pictures to help to kind of illustrate the story. So then the next frame, it says a lot of people were worried for Daniel about all of this, and it shows all of the people who were in the story. And then the next frame says, Mom is made sure Daniel will be safe and is able to live with Grandma and Gwen while Mom and Dad get help for their problems with alcohol and anger. Mom and Dad want Daniel to know he's a good boy and they love him. While Dad is in jail and Mom is in a place to get help for her problems, Grandma Gwen will take Daniel to see them. Grandma, uncle, or auntie will be there to be sure Daniel is safe and there is no drinking or fighting. So, what I like about this story, and the reason why I'm showing it to you, is because, as you can see, it tells the truth, right? So we don't hide from the child why they are in care, okay? We don't refuse to talk to them about it. Remembering as well that many children will wrongly and mistakenly somehow blame themselves or think that maybe they were responsible for the reasons why they had to leave their parents' care. So it's really important for us to be really honest and also to but also to use language that the child would use mostly, and children that the child understands, and to do it in a way that says, this was what was happening. So we don't say, this was happening and these were the ways that all of the adults behaved and let themselves down and let others down or anything like that. We just say, this is what happens. If there is disagreement, we can say, this is what, what mommy would say about what happened, and this is what daddy would say about what happened, and this is what I think what happened. Sometimes grown-ups see things from different points of view, and that's okay, and it is confusing, and you can admit that as well. But it's really the idea is basically that when we speak to children about trauma, as I said, we let them take the lead. We let them decide where and when they want to talk about it. And we let them talk as much as we can without kind of asking questions or interrogating them or probing for details or anything like that. Sometimes you might need to clarify something, especially if they're telling you something that you may need to let somebody else know about. But in general, I would say that in having spoken to children in the past, what my approach is always, if you let the child take the lead, they will be in control then of where the story goes or the conversation goes, and that's really, really important. And if they ask you questions, try to tell the truth and be honest with them as much as possible, but in an age-appropriate way, and try to refrain from judgment. So we all have a lot of hurt and pain wound up with the circumstances that children have gone into care, and I have it in my own extended family, so I understand it from a personal level as well. But we also have a duty of care towards the children to make sure that they have a right to have a relationship with their parents, and that we should respect that right, so that when they're adults, they will be able to make their own choices about who they want to have an ongoing relationship with. And we wouldn't want them to come back to us and say, you influenced me or you prevented me from having a relationship with somebody who's a really important person in my life. Okay, the next section then I have to talk to you about is navigating access. And so access or contact visits can be extremely challenging. They can be a source of a lot of stress and pain for both for everybody, really, for parents or extended family members, for carers, and for children and young people. So, you know, there's a lot of people involved in usually in this situation who are stressed out and worried. Everybody wants it to go well and wants it to be something positive, but we know that the reality of the situation is often it is a less than positive experience. So here's some tips and some practical ideas to help you with navigating access. So the first thing that I would advise you to do is just to try to kind of to keep the main thing the main thing. And what I mean by that is the most important thing is the child's safety and well-being now and into the future. So what that means is that obviously if children are not able to be with their parents, then they still have the right to have some sort of within the bounds of what is safe for them and what's in their best interests, to have some sort of relationship with their parents. And so when we kind of keep our focus in that and understand that this is kind of our priority, then that should dictate then our decisions. So I had a caregiver who was a kinship carer, who I was supporting, and she was minding a little girl who would get incredibly anxious about access, and even talking on the phone to her mother. She would not want to do it. She'd be so stressed out in the kind of days beforehand. And, you know, this caregiver was asking me, like, should we just not do it? So should we just say, you know, we're not doing it, and just go back to the court and go back to the judge and say we're not going to do it because she gets too upset. And I absolutely understood. And I totally understood where the caregiver was coming from. She wanted to protect this child, and she didn't want her to be suffering the way that she was. And so, but what I said to her was, we need to kind of consider the big picture here. And the big picture here is that this little girl, let's call her Maria. Maria has a mother, and she will have to, that's a relationship that will endure for her entire life. And what we want is for Maria, when she's a grown up, to look back on this time and to say, yeah, the adults helped me to maintain a connection, whatever that connection could be. So it might be that we have to reduce the frequency of the phone calls, or it might be that we can maybe use letters and emails, or even video messages, or, you know, something, but anything just to kind of to keep the connection is super duper important. Okay, so the practicalities of it. What I would say, my advice is to make sure that children are prepared. So what that can look like is that we give them, just going to move something. We give them a lot of predictability. So we have some sort of calendar. We have the days marked up on the wall. We have an alarm in their phone, something to let them know when it's happening. So we have a policy of no surprises. We also can create a social story, and I will explain about that in the next slide. But it's really to make sure that when I talk about predictability, that everything around the access or contact visit remains as predictable as it can be. So most of the anxiety that the child has about spending time with family during access is that they don't know what's going to happen. So what we do is we try and calm that stress response by keeping their life as predictable before and after as much as we possibly can. Other things that we can do is we can give them something of ours to take along with them on the access visit, or we can give them, we can put an alarm on their phone, or a watch or something like that, or a timer, anything for them to be able to check how long, when they're coming back, that kind of thing. I had one caregiver who would give, she had a key ring, and she would give this key with a spare key, a key ring with a spare key on it, to the child that she was living with. And she said, now you put this in your pocket, and then when you come back from your visit with mommy, you can give that back to me. And it was a way of just kind of giving the child something physical, belonging to the carer, so that the child knows that after the visit they're going to come back, and they're going and things are going to carry on like normal. We can't basically assume that children understand everything that's happening. They're not necessarily aware of the fact that if they go for a visit with mom or dad, especially the younger they are, that they're not going to go home with them. And the other thing, of course, is that, they may be hearing things from their parents as well during the access visit that might be very confusing for them. So we have to, the caregiver then is in the position where they have to be as consistent and as predictable as possible. The next point then that I have is regulation. So helping children and young people stay regulated, again, before and after. So what does that look like? When I talk about staying regulated, what I mean is giving the child lots of access to things that help them to stay calm. All right. So I used the example earlier of the little boy that I was working with. The thing that really helped him to stay calm and also to sleep well was going to the swimming pool. And so what we made sure was that we kept his routine consistent, and that those 3 days a week, and then so that he had the opportunity to go to the pool the day before access and the day after access. And that way he had access to, so basically what you want to do is kind of set them up for success, and then also give them the opportunity to do something that will help them to feel calm afterwards. So whatever those activities are, it could be going for a run, a walk, it could be watching their favorite movie, it could be different kinds of play that they really enjoy, going for a bike ride, whatever the thing is, that helps them to feel really calm and well in themselves. So what you don't do is give a child, stressful situation, then stressful situation, then stressful situation, then stressful situation. You're going to end up then with a child who's completely overwhelmed and not able to cope. And then the last thing that I would recommend, and this is just going back to what I was saying early, just about reassurance. You want to be able to be emotionally available for the child for any worries that might come up. Everyone is emotionally invested in access, but no one is as emotionally invested in it as this child, who may have so many conflicting feelings about spending time with somebody that they're having an access visit with. So I mentioned, in terms of preparation, I mentioned something called a social story. And social stories are good not only for access, but actually for lots of different situations. So they were invented, first of all, by a woman called Carol Gray from the UK. And so if you look up social stories, Carol Gray, you'll find her website. But basically, she started writing these stories for kids with autism. And they are personalized short stories that explain a social event or situation. And one of the reasons why they work really well for children who've experienced trauma is because they let children know what to expect. So they kind of walk them through step by step what's going to happen and what's expected of them in a situation and what they can expect to happen. So it's things like who's going to be there, what's going to be happening, what time, what do people usually say in a particular situation, and what's going to happen afterwards. And they reduce anxiety by providing a predictable structure to the situation. They're also, so usually a social story is printed out. And so basically it's a series of kind of pictures and a little bit of words. And when it's printed out, what that means is that then it's a resource that the child can go back to again and again and again. So what you may be used to is children asking the same questions over and over and over again, because they are so much in their brainstem, in that survival kind of part of their brain, and so anxious that they can't actually use their memory. They can't access their memory. And so what this does is it adds kind of, and it's another tool in your toolbox to provide reassurance that you can say, you can read your story about access if you're worried about it, and that will tell you everything that you need to know. And it's a consistent message. It can, so not only the primary caregiver can read the story with the child, but any adult who is in the child's life can read the story with them as well. And then you know that everybody has the same script and it's a consistent message. So children are less likely to be confused by different people telling them different things about something that they're worried about. So social stories are not only just about access. They could be about, for example, a hospital visit. They could be about what to expect at a birthday party, what to expect when you're going to a new school, what to expect if you're going to visit a therapist or a counselor. So many experiences that might not be familiar to children, and these making a story like this can be really, really helpful. So let's have a look at one so I can give you an idea of what one could look like. Now, in the social stories that I used to make for children, I would always put in photos of the actual thing, or as close as possible. But this one is one that I found online, and it's just got kind of drawings. So this is a social story about a road trip. And hang on a second. Oh, these slides are in the wrong order, so you'll have to bear with me. Okay, so the road trip social story. So first of all, the introduction, we're going on a road trip, and what is a road trip? And then, how is it different from taking a plane or a train? And then it tells the child what happens on a road trip, that you might stop to get petrol, that you might stop to have something to eat, and that it's a long drive. And so these are different things that we can do while we're on the road trip. Like we can listen to music, we can play on a device, or we can share stories. And then in the end, it tells the child like the different times that they might have to take a road trip, and then what happens when they reach their destination, that they will then have to do the same in reverse. So this particular resource, so sorry, is from this website called bpi.com. But Carol Gray is kind of the original person who developed social stories, and you will find plenty of examples on her website as well. Just to remember, if you're interested in social stories, they are very heavily, as I said, associated with guides for autistic children, but they're not only for autistic children. They can be useful for all children, and I've used them for my own children who are neurotypical. And just because children like something, they like a story, so they know what's going to happen. Okay, so we are nearly there. So my last section then is just about special occasions. So as I said, Sometimes special occasions involve special stress. So one of the things that you can do is to explain in advance what to expect. I worked with children who had never celebrated Christmas before they came into care, and they had never celebrated birthdays. I remember there was one child that I was working with, and we gave him a birthday present for his birthday, and he wet himself when we gave him his present. He was so overwhelmed by this experience because he had never he actually lost control of his bladder. He was maybe, I'm going to say 7, yeah, and had never received a birthday present before. He didn't know what to expect for his birthday. Now he was okay. We sorted him out, and he was okay. But it was a real lesson to me, actually, because I realized that, yeah, not every child has the same experiences, and you can't make assumptions. So you explain in advance as much as possible what to expect, and you can use a social story as well. That is really useful. Keep things predictable. So same advice as for access or contact visits. Keep things as predictable as you can before and after the event. I remember working with a couple, and they were taking care of 3 siblings, and it was towards the end of the school year. So this was in New Zealand, where the end of the school year is also Christmas time, and it's also the start of the summer holidays. So a lot of people go away on holidays and things like that. And it is just an absolutely crazy time of year. There's always a million things happening, end of year events, Christmas parties, school kind of assemblies and prize givings, and then getting ready for Christmas, and then getting ready for summer holidays as well. And this caregiver, she decided to take the children to the park, where there was going to be a big kind of Christmas celebration and a concert one day after school. And of course, it's also the end of school term. So she called me the following day and she said, that was an absolute disaster. And I and when we talked about it, of course it was, because there were so many things happening at the same time. All she wanted to do was just do something nice for the kids. But they were incredibly irritable. They were complaining. Then one of them had a massive meltdown over something that seemed really trivial. She was frustrated and upset. So was her husband. It was just a big disaster. And actually, when we talked through it, what we realized is it was just way too much for the kids at the same time. Even though they were all nice things, it was too much. And I think that that really relates to the next point, which is manage your own expectations. So try to be realistic about how things are going to go. Don't expect that the children will necessarily thank you or will appreciate all of the effort that you have gone to. Okay. So you may have put a load of effort into buying, Christmas presents, or doing something special for a birthday, or a communion or a confirmation, or whatever is happening in your family. And uh, the children, so children sometimes are overwhelmed by that, and then they just can't cope with it. But the other thing is that sometimes children feel like if they acknowledge your importance and they acknowledge the good things that you do, that can feel like a betrayal of their own parents, and they may feel very conflicted about that. And as I said, it can be part of that push pull that children experience, where they want to love you and trust you and be happy with you, but at the same time, being close to somebody can feel really scary, and they may then just kind of feel really uncomfortable and push you away. And the last tip that I have is try to stay regulated yourself. So so both for yourself and for the child, that regulating input, those activities that they really enjoy the most and that make them feel the most calm and the most settled, you want to incorporate a lot of that in the before and after. So again, you're kind of setting them up for success. I'm just going to stop sharing there because I'm nearly finished, and um, I will put up on screen the um, the website address and also some other website addresses. But I just want to say, just before I kind of finish, that I did some work with Bruce Perry. As I said, I did a couple of years of study with him, and he always said, as the parent goes, so goes the child. And what he meant was that if the adults are stressed, if we are dysregulated, if we are living in our own kind of state of fight or flight or survival, we don't have access to all of the resources that we need to look after a child. And so, if it's possible, and I know it's challenging, and I know that circumstances can be really, really difficult, any opportunity that you can take to look after yourself as a caregiver will be of benefit to the child in your care. So I really just want to encourage you that if you do have those opportunities, to make use of them, and to not ever feel guilty, because when you prioritize your own well-being, what you're doing is you're also prioritizing the well-being of the children that you are looking after. Um, so this is, if you're interested in learning more about what we do in Trauma Informed Practice Ireland, you can Google us, or you can send an email to traumainformedcare@qualitymatters.ie. That is up on the screen. And then my very last slide is a resource page. So I just have some websites there that have a lot of information about parenting children who have experienced trauma. So the National Traumatic Stress Network is in the US. Child Trauma Academy is Bruce Perry's website. Dan Hughes and Dan Siegel are both authors that you may already be familiar with them. They have done a lot of work and developed a lot of resources for helping children who have experienced trauma. So those are all big recommendations if you are interested. And those websites then have loads of resources and book recommendations and things like that, if you want to learn any more. I would love to answer any questions that people have. If you want to put a question in the Q&A, you can do that now. Are there any questions at the moment? Laura and
Hi,
Emma.
Sinead.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I think everything you've said just rings through with what we hear in our peer groups and on our phone line. And I particularly love that quote around trauma involves relational wounding and recovery requires relational healing.
Mm,
And it just reminds us that there's always, where there is a child in front of you, where you have that relationship, that there is always opportunity for repairing that rupture. And some really practical tools there, which will be so helpful. So thank you. It's really insightful, and I'm looking forward to looking at some of these websites to dig in a bit further. There's no current questions in the Q&A box. I'll leave it another little second in case anyone does come in with any question. One thing that has arisen in our peer groups is for kinship carers who might have someone of that older teenage years, and particularly young teenage boys, and trying to navigate that when they're closed off and you feel like they're keeping it all in, and whether that's down to navigating a parent's addiction or the grief of a parent.
yeah.
But for that particular age group, I think there's a lot of worry, and in particular when it is addiction, holding the worry that what if that means that they're predispositioned, or within the community that they have easy access. Would you have any kind of tips around how to navigate
Yeah,
encouraging a
yeah.
child to open up, I suppose, and to make sure they're safe.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that when children are, so I'll give you an example and then I'll give you another example. One example that really struck me as being really cool was I was working with a young person who was refusing to come out of his room. He was gaming all day, every day, refusing to engage, wouldn't go to school, wouldn't talk to a counselor, there was nothing. And so what his caregiver started doing was playing video games with him. So they went into his world because he wouldn't come into theirs. And that was them saying, we're here, we accept you, we want to connect with you, we're willing to do whatever it takes. And it worked. Now it didn't work instantly. He wasn't like, hey guys, oh, everything is awesome, but it helped them to make that connection. So a tip that I always give people is try to find small instances or moments of connection. Anything. It could be one of those funny handshakes that you do. It could be singing a song when you see the kid, and they sing it back to you. It could be just giving them a high five on the way out the door. Any small moment of connection, remembering that connection can feel very uncomfortable for children, that they can feel weirded out and like, no, this is too much. If you sit down with them, are like, oh, I really care about you, that
Mm.
sometimes is not actually the best approach. Um, but any small moment of connection, anything that you can find to do together with them, especially parallel things, are really good.
Yeah,
So not face to face, but things like going on a bike ride together or washing the car together or doing things that, and then you will find that children are more open sometimes, but you have to spend the time, and you have to be creative.
yeah.
That was a very short
Finding,
answer.
no, I think you're right. It's around those finding the connection, and maybe it doesn't have to be talking about the thing, whatever the
Yeah.
thing is, but it's still
Yeah.
that safe connection. And I
Yes.
think you're reminding me of social care world where often the car was a safe place to have a conversation or doing a baking activity side by
Yeah.
side. There is some questions come through there, and I'm going to keep it anonymous. I have two children in my care for over a year and a half. I was happy to participate in access with their mum, and we agreed in court she would have access on a Monday. However, mum has not availed of access, and it has been almost a year since she has seen her youngest son. How do I manage this situation?
Oh God, that is so tough. I really, my heart goes out to you. So unfortunately, the only influence that you have in this situation is with the children, and if their mother is not able to manage to do what she needs to do to see them, the only thing that you can do is to reassure them that she does still love them and that she is not able to see them at the moment. And that's all that you can do, I suppose. Yeah. What would you think, Laura?
Yeah, I think even some of the pieces you spoke about earlier in relation to the words and pictures, that some of that, and there is, I can actually, there's some children's books that can be really useful ways. It depends on the age of the child, of course, but there is some children's books for younger children to look at addressing some of those difficult conversations. And again, that can be in a place that isn't as face to face eye contact. If you're reading a book, you might be side by side and you're looking at
Mm,
a storybook in front of you. It can be a
mm,
little bit less intimidating or feel a little bit less intense for a child. Um, so some children's books can navigate some of those
yeah,
stories.
yeah,
Even around the invisible string, I think is a lovely one around
yeah,
looking at,
yeah, that's
you're
true.
still connected. It depends on what the circumstance is, whether that is, there's some Sesame Street resources where they approach conversations about incarceration or addiction. They have that kind of maybe American tone, but they are useful ways of having conversations if it's a young child that you're speaking
Yeah,
about.
yeah,
Um, but again, it comes back to your relationship with them and you being that one good adult. And you talked about that, about whether that could be a teacher or a coach or a key worker. But so many
Mhm.
kinship carers are that one good adult
Yes.
for our children, and they are
Yeah.
their roots and their nurture and their
Yeah.
steady and their safety. And that's what you were doing, and that's what you're creating.
Yeah.
The answer there, I have used the invisible string, which was helpful. The children are 8 and 12, and they're very different developmental stages as well. And what you might be saying to a 12-year-old might be very different to an 8-year-old, but perhaps
Yeah.
not, if what Sinead said earlier about stage, not age. But I can
Mhm.
follow up with this person offline to see if there's anything particular that we can look at for maybe the older age, because they're coming into a different developmental stage, and
Mhm.
puberty and all of that coincides with that.
Mhm.
Um, there's another question there. Can you please repeat the quote? I think that was the quote that I spoke about at the
Yeah.
start, where it was trauma involves relational wounding and recovery requires relational healing. Have I got that one right, Sinead?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the one. And also just I just in case, that quote from Bruce Perry as well. He says, "As the parent goes, so goes the child," and I think that that is so important, and also so reassuring sometimes for caregivers to understand that that they also have needs. You have needs, and if your needs are ignored or not being met at all, then how on earth are you expected to provide all of the care that you need to provide to children with sometimes incredibly complex needs? Um, so yeah, that was just an encouragement, I suppose, for everybody to support carers,
Yeah.
which we all would endorse.
Yeah, and that vicarious trauma piece, the importance of self-care within it,
Yeah,
because you're and by our very nature as carers, you tend to just keep giving until the cup is empty.
yeah,
So yes,
yeah.
I don't see any other questions come through. But thank you so much, Sinead, for your time. It was really, really insightful and echoes so much of what we see on the phone line. So thanks for your expertise. And wishing everybody a wonderful Kinship Care Week. And thank you for joining us for the webinar.
Thanks, Laura, and
Bye.
it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye. Bye.